How did the pioneers of the Wild West find water and escape the heat? You'll be shocked when you learn the details. When the pioneers of the American Wild West, settlers and gold prospectors, set out for uncharted lands, they faced harsh conditions, especially in desert regions.
This here is where the river bends.
The desert was unforgiving, and the ability to find water and escape the merciless heat was a matter of life and death. They used both centuries-old methods of indigenous peoples and their own ingenuity to survive where life seemed impossible. Watch the video to the end to find out how a simple cactus could save an entire family from thirst, and what unexpected item of clothing was more important than a gun in the fight against the sun. Are you ready to learn the truth about how people actually survived in the desert? Water was the main currency and the main goal of any traveler. The search for sources was a daily, exhausting task on which everything depended. The pioneers quickly realized that they needed to move from one source to another, planning their route in advance. Imagine a caravan of wagons moving through the scorched desert. Each family has a few barrels of water, but they are heavy, take up space, and are being depleted at an alarming rate. If you were a settler on the Oregon Trail in the 1850s, you would know that the next water source could be 3 days away, or it might not exist where the map promised. Every morning you wake up with one question: will there be enough water? Maps were inaccurate or non-existent, so you had to rely on other signs. Native Americans taught settlers to read the landscape. For example, clusters of greenery, especially willows or poplars, almost always indicated the presence of groundwater close to the surface. Even if a river dried up, you could dig a hole in its bed, especially at bends, and wait for it to fill with seepage water. This method, known as a sand well, saved countless lives. It was simple, but it required patience and knowledge of where to dig. The knowledge of Native Americans was truly critical to the survival of the settlers. Native Americans had lived in these lands for millennia and knew the location of every spring, the seasonal changes in waterways, and the signs of hidden aquifers. Willows and poplars require constant access to water, so their presence is a reliable indicator of groundwater, no more than a few meters below the surface. The sand well technique really worked. In dry riverbeds, water often continues to flow beneath the surface. By digging in the sand at bends, where the water slows down and seeps deeper, it is possible to reach a wet layer. Water slowly fills the hole, often cloudy and requiring filtration, but drinkable. Animals were also excellent indicators. Flocks of birds at dawn and dusk often circled above water sources. Animal tracks converging at a single point also led to the coveted watering hole. Experienced trackers could tell from the tracks how long ago the animal had been at the water and how thirsty it had been. Another source of knowledge was trappers and mountain men who had spent years in the wilderness. They knew the location of hidden springs and shared this information with migrant caravans. This knowledge was passed down by word of mouth and was worth its weight in gold. Observing animal behavior was a reliable method. Deer, antelope, and other herbivores must drink daily, especially in hot weather. Their trails converging at a single point almost always lead to water. Birds of prey are less dependent on water, but pigeons and other grain-eating birds must drink regularly. Mountain men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Kit Carson were truly living maps of the West. They worked as guides for caravans, and their knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. Many migration trails were laid out along routes first explored by trappers. The pioneers also learned to collect dew. At night, they spread blankets or tarps on the ground, and in the morning, they squeezed out the accumulated moisture. It was a laborious process that yielded little water, but in a critical situation, it was a lifesaver. Some plants, such as cacti, could serve as a source of moisture. By cutting open the flesh of a barrel cactus, it was possible to obtain a juicy, though not always pleasant-tasting mass. However, caution was required here. Not all cacti were safe, and some could cause severe illness. Collecting dew works, but it provides very little water. In desert regions, dew rarely forms due to low humidity. In more humid areas, several hundred milliliters can be collected overnight from a large area of fabric. But this requires considerable effort for minimal results. The myth about barrel cacti needs clarification. Yes, some species contain moist pulp, but it is often bitter and can cause nausea and diarrhea, which accelerates dehydration. This is an extremely unreliable source of water. It is much more effective to look for real sources or dig in dry riverbeds. What do you think about which of these methods of finding water could work in modern survival conditions? Want to know the secret that saved people from the scorching sun? The heat was no less dangerous an enemy than thirst. Direct sunlight could lead to heat stroke in a matter of hours. Therefore, proper organization of the daily routine and the use of shelters were critically important. Imagine an air temperature of 45 degrees Celsius and a sand surface temperature of 70 degrees. Without shade, a person loses fluid at a catastrophic rate through sweat, breath, and radiation. If you were driving a van through the Mojave Desert in July, you would understand that every hour in the open sun brings you closer to heat exhaustion when the body loses its ability to cool itself. Caravans usually started moving before dawn and stopped during the hottest hours of the day from about noon to 3 or 4 in the afternoon. During this time, people and livestock rested in the shade of carts, rocks, or sparse trees. This simple rule allowed them to conserve energy and avoid overheating. They used whatever was at hand to create shade. Tarpaulins stretched between the carts created a large shady canopy under which the entire camp could shelter. If there were no carts, they used blankets stretched over sticks stuck in the ground. This routine was borrowed from peoples who had lived in hot climates for millennia, traveling in the cool morning hours, a long siesta at noon, resuming the journey in the evening, and sometimes traveling at night under the full moon. Livestock also suffered from the heat. Oxen and horses could die from heat stroke just as easily as humans. Improvised shelters reduced the temperature beneath them by 10-15 degrees compared to the open sun. This was the difference between survival and death. Clothing played a key role in protecting against the sun. Contrary to modern beliefs, the pioneers did not wear open clothing. They preferred loose, light cotton or linen clothing that completely covered the body. This created an air gap and protected the skin from burns. A wide-brimmed hat was an absolutely indispensable accessory. It protected not only the head and face from the sun, but also the neck. Losing a hat in the desert could be fatal. Therefore, it was carefully guarded and often tied under the chin with a cord to prevent it from being blown away by the wind. A neckerchief, or bandana, was another multifunctional piece of clothing. When moistened with water, it helped cool the neck and head. When dry, it protected against dust and sand during storms, as well as sunburn. The principle of layered, loose clothing works by evaporative cooling and protection from direct sunlight. Bedouins, Tuaregs, and other desert peoples wear long, loose garments for the same reasons. Exposed skin quickly burns, loses moisture, and overheats. Wet fabric around the neck cools the blood flowing to the brain through the carotid arteries. This is a simple but effective way to regulate body temperature with minimal water consumption. Indigenous peoples used natural shelters such as caves and rock overhangs to escape the midday heat. Migrants adopted this practice, using any features of the terrain to organize their midday rest. Knowledge of the terrain once again became the key to survival. At night, the temperature in the desert can drop sharply. Therefore, while escaping the heat of the day, one could not forget about the cold of the night. The same clothing that protected from the sun during the day helped to keep warm at night. Knowing how to dress properly was an art. Even the color of clothing mattered. Light colors reflected the sun's rays while dark colors absorbed them. Therefore, most settlers wore light-colored clothing that had faded in the sun. It was simple physics working for survival. The temperature difference between day and night in the desert can reach 30-40 degrees. During the day, it is 45 degrees Celsius. At night, it is 5 or 10 degrees Celsius. The same wool or cotton clothing that protected from the sun retained body heat at night. Multifunctionality was critical. Settlers could not carry a large wardrobe. The physics of color really matters. White or light-colored fabric reflects up to 70-80% of solar radiation, while dark fabric absorbs 80–90%. In hot climates, this makes a significant difference in the heat load on the body. But what if I told you that the simplest shelter from the heat was right under your feet? Now I'm going to show you a time machine. Imagine a house built of mud and straw that stays cool in summer and warm in winter. That's what adobe or mud brick houses were like. A brilliant invention that settlers borrowed from the Spanish Indian culture of the Southwest. Imagine a construction technology that is several thousand years old but surpasses many modern materials in energy efficiency. If you were a settler in New Mexico in the 1850s, arriving from wooded Pennsylvania, you would have been amazed by the dried mud houses that stayed cool in 40-degree heat without any air conditioning. Adobe is a building material made of clay, sand, water, and straw. This mixture was molded into bricks and dried in the sun. Its simplicity of manufacture and the availability of materials made it ideal for construction in desert conditions, where wood was scarce. The main secret of adobe was its thermal inertia. Thick clay walls heated up very slowly during the day, keeping the inside of the house cool. At night, they slowly released the heat accumulated during the day, warming the dwelling on cold desert nights. Building such a house was labor-intensive, but did not require complex technology. The whole family took part in mixing the clay and shaping the bricks. It was a collective effort that united the community. The adobe technology is truly ancient. It was used by the civilizations of Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago. In North America, it was developed by the Pueblo peoples long before the arrival of the Spanish. The proportions of the mixture varied, but the typical composition was 15–30% clay, 70–85% sand and gravel, and straw for reinforcement. Thermal inertia is a key property. A wall 50–60 centimeters thick has a time delay of about 10 to 12 hours. This means that the peak daytime heat reaches the inner surface of the wall in the evening, when it is already cooling down outside, and vice versa. The house constantly lags behind the outside temperature, smoothing out extremes. The roofs in such houses were flat, which was also part of the thermoregulation system. They were made of wooden beams, on which branches and straw were laid, and a thick layer of clay on top. Such a roof served as an additional insulator from the heat. The windows in adobe houses were small and set deep into the walls. This reduced the amount of direct sunlight entering the interior and helped to keep it cool. Windows were often positioned to create a draft that ventilated the room. Flat roofs were practical in arid climates with infrequent rainfall. They were constructed of vigas, wooden beams covered with latillas, thin branches, savannas, reed mats, and a final layer of clay 10–15 centimeters thick. This mass added thermal inertia. Deep window openings provided shade. The thickness of the walls turned the windows into tunnels that let in light but blocked direct rays for most of the day. The placement of windows for cross ventilation was critical. The cool night air cooled the massive walls. Another type of dwelling ideally suited to hot climates was the dugout, a semi-underground dwelling. It was dug into the slope of a hill or ravine. The earthen walls and roof served as an excellent natural insulator. Such dwellings were very cheap to build, as they required a minimum of imported materials. Often, the only purchased elements were the door and window frame. For many poor migrants, this was the only affordable way to get a roof over their heads. The floor of a dugout was earthen. In summer, it remained cool, and walking on it barefoot was a real pleasure. It was a simple but effective way to keep cool. Dugouts were common on the Great Plains, where wood was scarce and soil was abundant. They were dug into a slope or cut into the sod. The front wall was often made of sod or boards, and the roof was made of poles covered with sod. The temperature of the earth at a depth of 1 to 2 meters remained stable throughout the year, around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in a temperate climate. The dugout effectively used the earth as a giant thermostat. However, dugouts had serious drawbacks: poor ventilation, dampness, leaks during rain, collapsing roofs, and infestation by rodents and snakes. Many people only lived in them for the first year until they built more durable dwellings. It was a temporary solution for survival, not comfortable long-term housing. These simple but wise architectural solutions allowed people not only to survive, but to live comfortably in extreme conditions. They demonstrate a deep understanding of the laws of nature and the ability to use them to their advantage. What if everything you've been taught is outdated? We are used to thinking that the main dangers of the desert are thirst and heat, but there is another, no less formidable force of nature: the wind, which generates dust storms. A sudden wall of dust could reduce visibility to zero, knock you off course, and bury you under a layer of sand. Imagine seeing something on the horizon that looks like a giant dark wave hundreds of meters high, moving at a speed of 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. You have a maximum of 10-15 minutes to prepare. If you were a migrant leading a caravan through Arizona, you would know that those few minutes would determine whether you would survive and keep your possessions. The dust storm, or haboob, approached like a dark, swirling wall hundreds of meters high. Experienced travelers knew that when they saw such a phenomenon, they had to seek shelter immediately. Trying to wait out the storm in the open was extremely dangerous. The most reliable shelter was provided by carts. People and animals huddled together on the leeward side. The carts were placed in a circle to create a barrier against the wind and flying sand. The animals were turned with their backs to the wind to protect their eyes and respiratory organs. People covered their faces with scarves or any available fabric to avoid inhaling dust. Breathing in such conditions was difficult as sand got into their eyes, ears, and noses. After the storm, everything, clothes, hair, food, was covered with a thick layer of fine dust. The term haboob is of Arabic origin and is used by meteorologists to describe intense dust storms. They form when a cold downdraft from a thundercloud hits the ground and spreads outward, lifting huge amounts of dust and sand. The wall of dust can reach a height of 1 to 3 kilometers and move at speeds of up to 100 kilometers per hour in the most intense cases. The dust in such storms consists of particles ranging in size from 1 to 100 microns. Fine particles penetrate deep into the lungs, causing respiratory problems. Visibility drops to almost zero, causing disorientation and panic. Sometimes the only way to survive the storm was to simply lie down on the ground and cover yourself with a blanket, waiting for the storm to subside. Getting up and trying to walk was pointless and dangerous. It was easy to lose your bearings and get lost just a few steps from the camp. Dust storms were especially dangerous for livestock. Animals could panic and scatter, making them almost impossible to find later. Therefore, herders tried to keep the herd together, calming the animals with their presence. Disorientation in a dust storm is absolute. People would get lost just a few meters from their camp and die of dehydration, wandering in circles. Lying on the ground reduced the impact of the wind and decreased the amount of dust inhaled. Livestock was particularly vulnerable. Horses and oxen panicked and tried to flee from the storm. The loss of draft animals was a disaster for the caravans, meaning it was impossible to continue the journey. Even after the storm ended, its effects were felt for a long time. Dust creaked between the teeth and got into food and water. The mechanisms of guns and watches were clogged with sand and required thorough cleaning. In addition to large-scale dust storms, small sand whirlwinds known as dust devils often occur in the desert. Although not as dangerous as haboobs, they could knock off a hat, overturn a pot of food, or scare horses. Fine dust penetrates everywhere, into clothing, bedding, and sealed containers. Cleaning weapons was critical. Sand in the mechanism could jam the bolt, rendering the rifle useless in a moment of danger. Dust devils are local convective phenomena that occur when the surface is heated strongly. They reach 10-100 meters in height and move chaotically. Although usually harmless, large dust devils can be dangerous. Pioneers learned to predict the approach of a storm by changes in the color of the sky, increasing winds, and the behavior of animals. This gave them precious time to prepare and find shelter. Survival in the desert was a constant struggle in which observation and foresight were valued as much as strength and endurance. Signs of an approaching dust storm include darkening of the horizon, a sharp drop in temperature, increased and changing wind direction, and restless animal behavior. Experienced travelers could get 15-30 minutes of warning, which was critical for preparation. Ready to learn how pioneers preserved food in conditions where there were no refrigerators? In In desert conditions where temperatures could rise to extreme levels, preserving food was a real problem. Without refrigerators, meat, milk, and vegetables would spoil in a matter of hours. Therefore, pioneers used preservation methods that had been proven over centuries. Imagine a situation where you shot a deer in the Mojave Desert in July. You have 50 kilograms of meat, the temperature is 40 degrees Celsius, and the nearest settlement is a week's journey away. Without preservation, this meat will become inedible in 6-8 hours. If you were a hunter or a settler, you would understand that the ability to preserve your prey is the difference between being full and going hungry for the next few months. The most common way to preserve meat was to dry it. Bison, deer, or antelope meat was cut into thin strips and hung out in the sun and wind. In the dry desert air, it quickly lost moisture, turning into jerky, hard but very nutritious dried meat. Such meat could be stored for months without losing its properties. It could be eaten dry, soaked in water to make soup, or ground into powder. It was the ideal camping food. Light, high in calories, and long-lasting. The drying process works by reducing the water activity in the product below the level required for bacteria to multiply. The meat loses 60–70% of its weight, but retains most of its protein and calories. Thin strips 3 to 5 millimeters thick dry out in 1–2 days in a hot, dry climate. Sometimes the meat was lightly salted or smoked for additional protection against spoilage and to deter insects. Flies were a constant problem. Their larvae could spoil drying meat in a matter of hours. Another ingenious invention of the Native Americans, which was adopted by settlers, was pemmican. It was a mixture of dried and ground meat, melted fat, and dried berries. This high-calorie paste was a real energy bar of its time. Pemmican was incredibly nutritious and could be stored for years. A small piece was enough to keep you going during a long journey. Hunters, trappers, and Army Scouts took it with them on long trips. Pemmican is truly an outstanding survival product. Typical composition: 50% dried meat, ground into powder, 50% melted fat, plus dried berries for flavor and vitamins. The calorie content reaches 500–600 calories per 100 grams. Fat is critically important. It seals the dried meat, preventing oxidation and spoilage. In properly prepared pemmican, stored in a cool place, there is almost no microbiological activity. There are documented cases of pemmican being consumed that was 50 years old or more. Fruits and vegetables that were successfully grown or harvested were also dried. Apples, apricots, pumpkins, and corn were cut up and laid out in the sun. When dried, they took up little space and could be stored for a long time, serving as a source of vitamins during the winter months. Dairy products were the most difficult to preserve. Milk was used to make cheese or butter, which could be stored longer than fresh milk. However, they also required a cool place for storage. Drying fruits and vegetables was a universal method. Dried apples, apricots, and peaches retain most of their sugars and some vitamins. Vitamin C is partially destroyed during drying, but vitamins A and some B vitamins are better preserved. Milk spoils in the heat within 2–4 hours. Cheese, the result of fermentation and moisture removal, could be stored for weeks or months. Salted butter in airtight packaging remained edible for several weeks, even in the heat. A desert refrigerator was often used to store food, a pit dug in the ground and covered with a wet cloth. The evaporation of water from the surface of the cloth cooled the interior. This simple device allowed perishable foods to remain fresh for a while longer. Water was stored in wooden barrels or leather wineskins. But the best container for water in hot weather was considered to be an olla, a porous clay jug. Water seeping through the walls and evaporating cooled the contents of the jug, keeping the water cool even on the hottest day. Evaporative cooling is an effective physical process. Moist fabric or porous clay allows water to seep through and evaporate, removing heat. In dry climates, it can lower the temperature by 10 to 20 degrees below the ambient temperature. Ollas, traditional Spanish clay jugs, worked really well. Their unglazed surface allowed for constant, slow evaporation. The water inside stayed 15–20 degrees cooler than the air. It was an ancient but effective air conditioner for drinking water. What if I told you that everything you believed was not true? Many pioneers set out for the West, considering these lands wild and empty. However, they soon discovered that people had lived here for centuries, perfectly adapted to these harsh conditions. The survival of the settlers depended largely on whether they could learn from the knowledge and experience of the Native Americans. The Apache, Navajo, Hopi, and other tribes of the desert Southwest had a deep understanding of the ecology of their region. They knew where to find water, which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to hunt, and how to build dwellings that were perfectly suited to the local climate. It was from the Indians that the settlers learned to find water by following animals or recognizing indicator plants. They adopted the technology of building adobes and dugouts. They learned to make pemmican and jerky, which allowed them to solve the problem of food storage. Native Americans were masters at using local plants. They knew which plants could be used for food, which for medicine, and which for making ropes, baskets, and clothing. For example, they made strong fibers from yucca, and its fruits and flowers were used for food. They taught the white settlers how to use agave, or mezcal. This plant was a veritable supermarket of the desert. Its core was baked to produce sweet and nutritious food. Its leaves were used to make fibers, and its juice was used to make drinks. The clothing of the indigenous peoples was also perfectly adapted to local conditions. Soft leather moccasins were light and comfortable for walking on rocky ground. Suede clothing protected against both the sun and the night cold. Those who treated the savages and their methods with contempt often paid for it with their lives. Those who were open to dialogue and willing to learn were given a chance to survive. The history of the conquest of the West is not only a history of conflict, but also a history of complex cultural exchange. Even in military tactics, the American Army was forced to learn from the Apaches. Their ability to use the landscape, to be invisible and resilient, made them virtually elusive. The generals who fought them respectfully called them tigers in human form. Without the knowledge accumulated by indigenous peoples over thousands of years, the settlement of the American West would have been much slower and bloodier. It was a harsh lesson that showed that wisdom and experience are often more important than technology. Want to know what diseases the pioneers in the desert suffered from most often and how they fought them? In frontier conditions, the nearest doctor could be hundreds of kilometers away. Therefore, every settler had to be a bit of a doctor for their family. A pioneer's first aid kit consisted of simple but proven remedies, as well as knowledge of medicinal plants, often borrowed from Native Americans. One of the main problems was dysentery, caused by drinking contaminated water. To treat it, they used decoctions of oak bark or other plants with astringent properties. They also used powder from burnt horn, which acted as an absorbent. Sunburn was common. It was treated with aloe juice, which soothed the skin and promoted healing. If aloe was not available, sour milk compresses were used, or the burned areas were simply sprinkled with flour. Snake and insect bites were deadly. Although there were no effective antidotes, they cauterized the wound with a hot iron or gunpowder to destroy the poison. They also applied a tourniquet above the bite and tried to suck the poison out of the wound. Simple antiseptics such as turpentine or whiskey were used to treat wounds. The wounds were washed, dirt and foreign bodies were removed, and then a bandage made of clean cloth was applied. Cobwebs or cauterization were used to stop bleeding. Fractures were a serious injury. Splints were applied using any materials at hand: boards, branches, gun barrels. It was extremely important to fix the fracture correctly so that the bone would heal properly. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a frequent companion on long journeys. To prevent and treat it, they used decoctions of pine or spruce needles, as well as eating wild onions, garlic, and rose hips. Many of the medicinal plants used by the pioneers were familiar to them from their lives in the East. Chamomile was used as a sedative and anti-inflammatory agent, mint was used for stomach problems, and plantain was applied to wounds to promote healing. Survival in the desert was not only a physical but also a psychological challenge. The monotonous landscape, constant tension, and fear of the unknown all weighed heavily on the psyche. The ability to maintain composure and not panic was as important as the ability to find water. Imagine walking day after day across monotonous, scorched land, where every rock looks the same, the horizon is unchanging, and the only sounds are the creaking of carts and the clatter of hooves. If you were a migrant who had spent 3 months on the road without any signs of civilization, you would understand how easy it is to lose hope, how fear and monotony can break your spirit more than physical deprivation. One of the greatest dangers was the so-called desert fever, a state close to madness caused by dehydration, overheating, and visual hallucinations from mirages. A person could begin to see mirage oases, hear voices, lose their bearings, and make fatal mistakes. To combat this, it was important to maintain discipline and routine. Daily chores, caring for livestock, cooking, repairing equipment, structured time and prevented people from sinking into despair. Every member of the family, even children, had their own responsibilities. The term desert fever is not a medical diagnosis, but it describes real phenomena. Severe dehydration causes delirium, confusion, hallucinations, impaired judgment. Heat stroke affects the central nervous system, leading to disorientation and irrational behavior. Mirage is a real optical effect caused by the refraction of light in layers of air of different temperatures. An exhausted person may mistake a mirage for real water and use their last strength trying to reach it. Structuring your day through routine is a psychologically sound survival strategy. Predictability reduces anxiety, while tasks give you a sense of control and purpose. Mutual assistance played a huge role. Caravans of migrants were close-knit communities where everyone helped each other. If someone's wagon broke down or a child fell ill, neighbors came to the rescue, shared supplies, and provided moral support. Faith and religion gave many people the strength to endure hardship. Evening prayers and Bible readings around the campfire were an important part of life. They provided hope and comfort and helped people make sense of what was happening. Music and songs were also a way to lift the spirits. Simple melodies played on the violin or harmonica brightened up long evenings and reminded people of home. Songs told stories, joked about hardships, and instilled faith in a better future. Social support is critical to psychological resilience. Isolation exacerbates stress, while community provides emotional support, practical assistance, and a sense of belonging. Caravans where people became divided or conflicted had significantly higher mortality rates. Religion provided psychological support, interpreting suffering through the lens of a higher meaning, hope for divine protection, and comfort in collective rituals. For many 19th century migrants, religious faith was a central part of their identity. Music served many functions: emotional release, social cohesion, preservation of cultural memory. A sense of humor was another lifeline. The ability to laugh at oneself and one's difficulties helped relieve tension. Western folklore is full of stories and tales in which the harsh realities of the desert are presented in a humorous light. Leadership played a key role. An experienced caravan captain who remained calm in a critical situation could instill confidence in everyone else. His word was law, and his experience was the main guarantee of safety. Humor as a coping mechanism is well documented in psychology. It allows you to rethink a stressful situation, reduces anxiety, and strengthens group bonds. Galgan humor is especially characteristic of high-risk professions and situations. Leadership was truly critical. Experienced caravan captains such as Stephen Meek and John Beadwell saved the lives of hundreds of people thanks to their knowledge of routes, their ability to make decisions in crises, and their ability to maintain morale. Poor leadership led to disasters. The infamous Donner Expedition of 1846-47, where a group got stuck in the Sierra Nevada snow and resorted to cannibalism, was partly the result of inexperienced leadership and poor decisions. The psychological resilience of the settlers deserves respect. Many of them had gone through traumatic experiences, lost loved ones, endured extreme hardship, but continued to move forward, building new lives in the West.
This won't hold.
The history of the conquest of the West is full not only of examples of heroism and fortitude, but also of tragic stories about those who did not survive. Most often, the cause of death was simple mistakes that could have been avoided. Studying these mistakes is an important lesson in survival. One of the most common mistakes was overestimating one's own strength and underestimating the dangers of the desert. Many set out on their journey with only a vague idea of what awaited them. They took inappropriate clothing and insufficient water and provisions with them. Attempts to shorten the journey by straying from the proven route often ended in tragedy. Such shortcuts could lead to waterless areas from which there was no escape. The famous story of Donner's Party is a vivid example of this. Overloading the wagons was another fatal mistake. People tried to take too many things from their past lives with them: furniture, pianos, books. This exhausted the draft animals, which were the main resource on the journey. When the animals collapsed from exhaustion, the wagon and all its contents had to be abandoned. Inexperience with weapons also led to accidents. In conditions of constant tension, an accidental shot could wound or even kill someone. Cleaning a loaded gun or careless handling of it near a campfire were frequent causes of tragedy. Conflicts within the caravan could lead to its breakup. A group that split up in the middle of the desert was much more vulnerable. The loss of unity and mutual assistance was tantamount to a death sentence. Ignoring the advice of experienced guides or locals was a display of pride that cost dearly. Those who thought they knew better often got into trouble. The ability to listen and learn was one of the main qualities of a survivor. Panic in a critical situation was the worst enemy. When water ran out or something broke, it was important to remain calm and assess the situation soberly. Panicked, rash actions only made the situation worse. The survival experience of the pioneers of the Wild West is not just a page in history. It is an invaluable collection of knowledge about how humans can adapt to the most extreme conditions. Many of their methods are still relevant today for tourists, travelers, and anyone who finds themselves in the wilderness. The principles of finding water, protecting oneself from the sun, and building temporary shelters are all part of modern survival courses. Food preservation methods, such as drying, are still used by hunters and tourists. The history of the conquest of the West teaches us the importance of planning and preparation. The success of any journey in extreme conditions depends 90% on how well you have prepared for it, studied the route, gathered the right equipment, and assessed the risks. It also reminds us of the importance of psychological resilience. The ability to control fear, not to panic, and to maintain a positive attitude are key factors for survival. The spirit of the pioneers, their unyielding will and optimism, are an example to follow. The experience of the pioneers shows how important it is to respect nature and learn from it. They did not try to conquer the desert, they learned to live in harmony with it. Those who succeeded in doing so achieved success. Their story is also a lesson in the importance of community and mutual aid. Surviving alone in the desert was virtually impossible. Only by joining forces could people overcome all difficulties. Today, when we live in a world of technology and comfort, it is easy to forget these basic skills. But knowing how to find water, build a fire, or construct a shelter gives a sense of confidence and independence. The legacy of the pioneers is not only the cities and roads they built, it is, above all, a spirit of resilience, ingenuity, and courage in the face of the unknown. It is an eternal reminder of what a person is capable of when they have a goal and a will to live. We see that the survival of the pioneers in the deserts of the Wild West was a true art, based on knowledge, experience, and incredible strength of spirit. They learned from the indigenous peoples, from nature, and from each other, turning a hostile environment into their home. Their ability to find water in parched earth, escape the merciless heat, and retain their humanity in inhuman conditions is admirable. This story is not just about the hardships of the past. It is a hymn to human adaptability and ingenuity, a reminder that we often learn the most important lessons when we are alone with nature. Which of the pioneers' survival methods did you find most surprising, and why? Do you think modern people could survive in similar conditions using only their knowledge and wits? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.